Hi everyone, my name is Saad Gulzar. I'm an assistant professor at Princeton University. I'm going to present some joint work with Mehmood, Daniel Rogger, and Juan Felipe Ladino. In this paper, we make use of the fact that information is increasingly available for public sector management across the world. So what we ask is if specifically centralized delivery units can capitalize on this information to deliver better public sector outcomes. We study these questions in the context of a delivery unit that was set up in Pakistan's Punjab province, which undertook high frequency monitoring of schools, and it highlighted certain facilities, certain districts in red whenever they were poorly performing. And then these results were discussed in quarterly meetings with the chief minister, and then also monthly meetings at the district level. The idea was that, using this information, specific points of interest could be highlighted, which required more follow-up. And by doing so, these effects would cascade down the hierarchical chain and lead to changes in specific outcomes in education. Now, monitoring requires at least two key components to be successful. First, you need these high frequency, highly disaggregated data coming from the specific units that you want to hold to account. But you also need to have a capacity to infer an appropriate counterfactual. What would have happened had these facilities not been performing poorly on the specific metric? So we need these kinds of thought experiments to be able to understand exactly what the impacts of these kind of centralized accountability mechanisms might be. And this is exactly what we're going to do in this paper. So what we do is we collect information at the school level from around 2011 to 2018 in the context of Punjab. So these include more than 50,000 plus public schools across all districts of Punjab and across all Marakis, which are units of accountability within the education, public sector education management in Punjab. Now, data from these schools were being collected independently, and these data were aggregated into these reports that the district managers and also the chief minister would see. Specifically, poor performing schools or district level officers were highlighted in red if their performance was below a certain threshold on the specific outcome that the managers were interested in thinking about. So these data were then fed into, as I said earlier, monthly district review committees. The idea was that at the district level, they would take stock of which facilities and which areas were poorly performing. And then they would meet, district managers would meet the chief minister in quarterly stock takes. And the idea there was that the chief minister would then hold these managers to account for how performance was happening within their own areas. The focus of these meetings was accountability, but also sanctions, with some potential for rewards for good performers, but a lot of sticks for bad performers. Of course, the key message here is that these are high-stake meetings, and these are interactions that are driven by accountability. So this is why we think this is a good case to think about how centralized information processing and accountability can have impact for public sector performance. So what do we do in terms of the methods in this paper? We study, or we ask if schools if a school is in a flagged markers, does the performance of that school improve relative to schools that are in a non-flagged marker? So we begin with an analysis at the markers level, and then later on, I'm also going to present to you a similar analysis at the district level. What we do is we use a difference in differences framework, which again, the idea here is to establish a relevant counterfactual. What would have happened to the school had it not been in a flagged markers? So, thinking about it over time. So before that would be the before after getting flagged in red. And you can also kind of construct another counterfactual, which is you can think about schools that are in a flagged markers versus schools that are in a non-flagged markers. So the treatment here is getting flagged. It's time varying in the sense that a school can get flagged at a particular point in time, and this allows us to construct a counterfactual both in terms of time, which is the before after flagging, and also in terms of the space, physical space, which is whether you are in a flagged markers or whether you're not in a flagged markers. In the paper, we talk about many technical aspects of it. We use the latest methods, such as a stack difference and differences design, to deal with some problems that exist in a more traditional difference and differences framework. Okay, there are, of course, problems with direct observation. Spending a lot of careful energy on constructing an appropriate counterfactual is extremely important. Why is it important? Well, let's think about it for a second. What would have happened if we failed to account for threats to identification in terms of constructing an appropriate counterfactual? Well, observational data will present movement in school level outcomes as an artifact of recovery from existing shocks. So the idea here is that you get flagged if you perform poorly in a specific period. If you only compare what happens to you after you get flagged, you automatically will be going back towards the mean. So that problem is called reversion to the mean. So simply watching a response to a flag without corrections might generate the wrong conclusions. You might think that, oh, just because I have moved up from the period at which I was flagged, doesn't necessarily mean that my performance has improved. It might simply be an artifact of me reverting to the mean. What if we observe just the immediate return of school outcomes to pre-shock level after the flag? How might we interpret that? Well, we might posit a positive effect of flagging, as I just said, but we are ignoring that a negative shock has led to the flagging in the first place. So what you also need is an examination of what was happening before the flagging period, because it could be the case, as I said, that the positive effect might be a reversion to the mean. And in fact, if you look at the data and you only study the effect of getting flagged, in this table, we see effects on teacher presence, student attendance, and functional facilities, the three key main outcomes. And we'll also show you outcomes on student learning, which is on math, English, and Urdu. Basically, across all of these, if you take this naive approach of only comparing places that become flagged and then comparing their outcomes in a subsequent period, you see these big improvements, both in test scores, but also in presence and functional facilities. Of course, as I said earlier, this is a bad conclusion to reach because you don't know what was happening before the period of flagging, and that's going to be sort of the key point that I'm going to make in this paper. So what we find is that after you account for these kinds of problems, you're going to find broadly null effects of flagging outcomes, and I'm going to show you that in a second. In places where you do find some significant effects, they're going to be very small in magnitude, and we'll see some persistence in recovery from a negative shock. So this figure basically presents to you the main results of the study across the 6 outcomes of interest: teacher presence, student attendance, functional facilities, and then test scores from math, English, and Urdu. So here's how to read this coefficient. We're going to be focusing on 2 samples. First, we call what we call full sample, which includes all schools in the database. And then there is what we call a threshold sample, which includes schools that are, or in a later case, areas that are going to be barely missing on getting flagged. So the idea here is you're comparing places that barely got flagged versus places that barely missed on getting flagged. And again, the idea here is that these 2 schools are more likely to be similar to each other. So comparing them makes a lot more sense. But basically, the pattern we see is very similar across both data sets. Now, what we do is we center the data set at 0, where period 0 is a period when a specific facility, let's say a school, gets flagged, or a Marcus gets flagged, as is the case in this analysis. And what we see is that places in blue are the full sample averages, differences between the places that get flagged and the places that don't get flagged. So you can see that the places that get flagged have this big negative shock in the period in which their outcomes are being monitored. In this case, teacher presence. This is the same case for student attendance, functional facilities, etc. So the idea here is that they were trending the same way as all of the other the non-flagged places that would be non-flagged eventually, but the places that eventually get flagged have this big negative shock. And what's most important is that by the time they actually end up having these meetings at the district level, they're already on their path to recovery. And by the second month after they get flagged, they have reverted back to what was happening before the period of flagging. This pattern is followed across all 6 outcomes. And our conclusion from this is that this is a big story of reversion to the mean, where some place is getting flagged, but it's going back to what it was like right before getting flagged. So the one story that's consistent with this is that the outcomes that we are studying here, such as teacher presence, student attendance, functional facilities, and so on, are the big shocks that operate in these spaces are not some underlying structural issues, but some idiosyncratic shocks that are happening to these locations. And by the time these locations get noticed, they're already on their path to recovery. So you can see this last point from, let's say, this figure over here. You can see that by the time this punishing period occurs, they're already on their path to recovery. And, in the period right after punishment, they're already back at exactly the mean. They're not better than the mean. They're not worse than the mean. They're at the mean. And this, again, is happening across all 6 outcomes that we look at. So what we find is that flagging has no substantive effect on school performance. We also test a whole bunch of other intermediate outcomes, such as how much effort the education department is putting into managing these schools. For example, by studying the probability of receiving a visit by a public official, we find no effect on that at all. We also find no effect on any changes in head teachers. So there are no intermediate effects either, as you might imagine, because there are also no changes in the actual outcomes of interest. We repeat the same exercise with district level rankings. Again, district level rankings occurred for the meetings with the chief minister as well. And basically what we show is that there's a lot of persistence in whether the districts are ranked poorly or whether they're ranked well, and they remain somewhat similar over time. So poor districts remain poor, good districts remain good, and there's some movement, a little bit of movement, some in the middle. But the results we find for district ranking are exactly similar to the results we find for markers level flagging. And again, we find that districts that are in the poor performance buckets have some shock or none at all in most of these outcomes, and they remain as they were before. So at the district level, we see no movements at all in any of the outcomes. We also have a bunch of other results. For example, we show that flagging does not correlate with changes in student budget measures. Flagging does not correlate with rotation of district level officers, and there's also no evidence that it is correlated with the path of employment of district officers over time. All of these results are in the paper, and I encourage you to take a closer look if you're interested in the manuscript. So in the final part of the paper, we ask, how could have frontline managers spent their time in other ways, or how could have the monitoring efforts been spent in other ways? And the way we do this is we try to ask if school outcomes can be improved by thinking a little bit about the role of head teachers, who we think of are these frontline managers, school level managers who really can make a difference in terms of outcomes for school. So what we do is we quantify the quality of a head teacher using the latest techniques as reported in Phoenicia 2022, which is published in Econometrica. And we basically show that relative to a period of time when a head teacher is changed, which occurs in period 0 on the x-axis over here, you can actually see big changes in school level outcomes, both across all levels, across all 6 of our outcomes, including teacher presence, student attendance, functional facilities, and also some results on math and Urdu, but no results on English. Basically, what this is showing is that when a school moves from a poor head teacher to a good head teacher, there can be big improvements. Now, why are we showing this? Well, we're showing this because a similar kind of analysis could have been done with the same data that were collected by the monitoring regime. But instead of focusing on outcomes which had these idiosyncratic shocks, they could have focused on outcomes such as identifying good quality head teachers and placing them to schools most in need. And that would have resulted in bigger gains in terms of education outcomes than what we saw with outcomes that have these idiosyncratic shocks. So to conclude, what we try to argue is that centralized accountability infrastructure did not have substantive impacts in the case of Punjab during the period that we study. There were no impacts on budgets, inputs, outcomes, or careers. The patterns of response that we see in the data are far closer to a story of reversion to the mean, where there was some idiosyncratic shock, and things moved back to the mean by the time the data were reported and considered in meetings. So is this a story of motion without movement? Well, the question is, how could the motion have been galvanized for changes in outcomes through some other means? Well, we say that centralized data collection has powerful features, such as identifying relative talent of frontline managers, in this case, head teachers, as I just showed you. With an appropriate analytics team at the PMIU, they could have understood the null effects of the scheme within the first few months, and instead used the amazing data infrastructure that they had put in place to identify talented teachers and allocated them to schools that needed those specific talents. The big point we want to make is that, big data is really powerful, but unlocking its advantages requires some careful thought in terms of design, the analysis, and a willingness to experiment. Perhaps the program ran for very long, and the energies could have been used to make changes, make greater changes through a more powerful analytics team. And I'll end there. Thank you.